It's the ERP Confab. I'm David Essex, industry editor at TechTarget's ERP website. Supply chain sustainability initiatives took a hit in the COVID-19 pandemic as companies struggled just to make and deliver products on time. But ethical sourcing has always been a challenge for companies, given the complexities of supply chains and the difficulty of getting visibility into the practices of suppliers, which can number in the thousands for large retailers and manufacturers. Companies are increasingly looking to artificial intelligence to manage the enormous amounts of data and analytics needed to tackle the problem. One of the vendors offering answers is Roboby, based in Sydney, Australia, which started in spend analysis and procurement management, and now also applies its AI-driven analytics platform to supply chain sustainability. In the podcast, Roboby CEO Julian Harris describes how the software helps companies, governments, and other organizations monitor supply chain risk, sustainability, and diversity by, for example, flagging suppliers that have been sanctioned for modern slavery or identifying opportunities to employ indigenous labor. He'll also explain where Roboby fits in ERP and supply chain management architectures, and how it helps organizations with their environmental, social, and governance programs. Julian, Roboby is primarily a procurement management and spend analytics software company. Can you talk a bit about the history of the company, its main products, and the types of customers you have?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, David, and thanks very much for inviting me onto this podcast. We set the company up in 2017, so 7 years ago now. And the one problem we were solving was visibility for chief procurement officers. So it started off very much as a spend analytics platform. And the problem that these people had was that they quite often had one or many ERPs across very large organizations and quite often couldn't get a single visibility across all their spend. So we set out to build this spend analytics platform, and we effectively take data from any and all ERP systems for usually very large companies or big government agencies, and we use AI to classify that data to a single taxonomy, and then effectively provide them a single pane of glass across all of their legacy systems so they can see all of their spend in every country and every currency in one place.
You've kind of given us a top-level view, but how would you describe the platform in somewhat more detail? In other words, its main functions and where it fits in the broader IT architecture among the systems that you've mentioned, ERP, there's supply chain management, sometimes separate tools, procurement, logistics, etc. Where does Roboby fit in there?
We started off as a spend analytics platform in 2017. By 2020, we realized, after doing quite a lot of work with some big corporates, both in the US, Europe, and in Australia, that there was also a need to analyze payments for treasury folk. So not just about procurement, how do I buy my ladder for $1 less, but for treasury, how do I spend more efficiently? So should I use supply chain finance? Should I use virtual credit cards to pay for some of my goods to improve my working capital? So we added a whole suite of payments analytics products. And then a lot of our clients started saying to us, well, we also are very interested in compliance and risk and ESG. So there's now 3 legs to the stool. We basically do spend analytics, payment analytics, plus risk and ESG. So it's a complete analytics suite sitting across a lot of your legacy systems.
So in their pitch for this interview, your PR team had a quote from you saying that, quote, global organizations have enormous opportunities to positively impact human rights, protect the environment, and be more inclusive of indigenous, diverse, and small businesses. And that Roboby does this by helping organizations with some important tasks such as monitoring supply chain risk, sustainability, and diversity through third-party risk management, flagging suppliers that have been sanctioned, mentioned in media, etc., and using R&D of the new environmental, social, and governance initiatives. So I'm wondering, Julian, if you can go into more detail about just how Roboby helps do those things.
I mean, our strapline is no more, buy better. And the vision for the company from its very early days was to really help organizations improve the way they spend. To be honest, a lot of people buy us because of a very hard ROI. They're looking for cost savings or they're looking for payment efficiencies. But at the heart of it, we're trying to help people do more with their spend. You know, if you look at the world, there's a lot of people doing a lot of philanthropic stuff. But if you look at B2B payments, that equates to $130 trillion a year globally. And if a small portion of that was pushed to minority type groups, to indigenous type groups, there's a massive amount of good that you could do, basically. Also, there's a lot of harm that's happening in people's supply chains, whether it's modern slavery. There's a bunch of things that basically are not that difficult to detect. So what we do as a business is we analyze all of the spend and all of the supply chain of a very large company, let's say like a Coca-Cola, but then depending on the risks and the some of the insights they want, we'll pull in third-party data feeds from people like Dow Jones, Equifax, EcoVadis, and create essentially a data lake for them where they can look at risk across their supply chain. So we'll look at adverse media, we'll look at cyber security, we'll look at whether people are on sanctions, we'll look at a whole suite of issues that there may be within the supply chain, and we do that near real time. Whereas lots of large organizations, they'll onboard a supplier once, and then 5 years later, they're really doing no real checks on them, basically. So we'll do some, I say near real time, it's not actual real time, but it's regular checks on these suppliers. Also, a lot of our clients want to know how much they're spending with minority businesses. Basically, they have targets to do that. And that's very easy for us to look at their spend, look at the minority suppliers, which is databases we can source, and see what percentage of their spend is with those minorities, but also look at categories where they could then increase the spend with those minorities.
You also say that Roboby helps companies gain a 360-degree visibility of their supply chain spend to drive efficiencies and reduce waste. But, I've been covering supply chain management for a while now, and visibility is really seemed like a complex problem that has almost seemed like a holy grail in supply chain management, and it's proved somewhat elusive in a lot of cases. As an AI technology, what role can Roboby play in providing that level of visibility?
You're absolutely right, David. So let me tell you, the first thing we don't do, we're not, and I don't think anyone is actually looking down every single layer of a supply chain, because that is incredibly complex. I mean, some of our clients have 100,000 suppliers as their first tier suppliers. That might go 10 or 20 layers down. So it is near impossible to look at every layer of everyone's supply chain. I think that's the really difficult nut to crack. From a visibility point of view, though, the first thing we do is, a lot of the companies we're dealing with are just acquiring companies left, right, and center. They end up with every flavor of ERP, so they've just never got a central view of their data, and they usually end up with armies of analysts pulling spreadsheets from every and all ERP and trying to cobble this together. So the visibility we give them is we'll pull data from contract systems from numerous ERPs and give them one view, and crucially, we put it all into the same taxonomy. We use a global taxonomy called UNSPSC, which is the United Nations taxonomy. We can map it to a local taxonomy if needed, but all of the same data in one taxonomy is the first piece. In terms of the depth of supply chain, the way we crack that is we tend to take a category view on risk. So for instance, if you're buying goods and services with cobalt on them, simple example, we know that if we look through that category of cobalt, that 2/3 of the world's cobalt is mined in the Congo, where there's a lot of child slavery. So the likelihood is that those commodities are flagged as red and something that somebody should have a look at, because there are certain categories that are risky and certain categories that historically are less risky.
You might have kind of answered this already, but I guess I'll still ask it. Isn't a large part of the problem of getting the data out of your hands in the sense that there needs to be stronger end-to-end integration and data management across systems, like something that you folks can't really be responsible for. Is that still something that needs to happen more for there to be even more accurate data and enough data to do this?
Yeah, well, in many ways, we're solving that problem. I've been in technology for at least 30 years now, and that whole integration problem never goes away, and people never get it done because by the time they've finished the project, somebody else has acquired a new company with new systems that don't comply with the old systems. So integration it never goes away. And if you look at most large companies' IT budgets, the CIO will spend 80% of his budget just keeping the lights on his existing infrastructure. That whole end-to-end integration just never really happens. So that's why we're very much a light footprint where we'll extract data from all of their systems and provide this single pane of glass across all of their systems. If you think about it, we're the swan going across the lake and there's a lot happening under the water. We just surface the data and give people accurate insights on top of it. So our platform is there's no real integration. It sits on top of whatever they've got.
I see. Maybe it's unfair to ask this too, but since you're looking at the broader market, okay.
Yeah.
What about the data collection problem at the small supplier level? And I've done a little bit of writing on this, not recently, but a few years ago, especially agricultural suppliers, which I know must be part of the sustainable sourcing part of what you do.
Yeah.
I know that some small suppliers, I think they use smartphones, tablets, other pretty affordable technology to at least enter data and maybe upload it over the satellite or some other way. And some of them, I think, probably have IoT sensors that can maybe gather data from the field, literally. But aren't a lot of these small suppliers essentially off the grid when it comes to being able to get enough data about what they're doing and how they're doing it and get it into the system so that it can be analyzed?
Yeah, that's a really great question, David. I don't know those suppliers as well as you clearly do. It isn't actually a problem for our platform because if you think about it, we are going in and analyzing the data of the large buyer. So let's say it's a Coca-Cola. We're going in and analyzing the data in Coca-Cola's ERP. So as long as those small farmers can present an invoice, it doesn't matter whether it's come off a smartphone or any other device, as long as they can present an invoice to Coca-Cola, we can analyze the data. Because the data we're analyzing is purchase orders, invoices. We're reading every line on every invoice and categorizing that data. So as long as they can present an invoice, there is no problem. We also look at contract data and other supplementary data. We've never actually ingested IoT data, but that would be quite an interesting thing to do. But yeah, as far as our platform's working, as long as they can present an invoice, it doesn't matter how big or small they are, we can analyze the data for the buyer.
Another major area of business for Roboby is risk management, and it looked to me like it's especially related to compliance. So your website says that Roboby streamlines that process by consolidating compliance data, automating routine risk checks to flag certain issues. Can you explain that a little bit more?
That's sort of the third leg of our stool. A lot of our clients, once we typically look at their spend and potentially look at opportunities or risk in that, they want to then manage those suppliers a lot closer. So we built a compliance platform where they can configure any series of questions. So they can ask them for their modern slavery statement, their carbon policies, a bunch of questions basically. But also then we do this real-time scanning on the supplier for the buyer. So we will pull in that third-party data we talked about and monitor on a real-time basis whether that supplier is on a sanctions list or whether they've been in the news for doing something good or bad, but the buyer will get alerts if the supplier is in the news. We'll screen them on a real-time basis for cyber security and things like that. So it's a whole suite of compliance and risk functionality to allow the buyer to check that the suppliers are still as they thought they were.
Can you give an example or two of a Roboby customers use the platform to achieve some real, quantifiable, I guess, results, or at least anecdotal results in how they do responsible sourcing and meet their diversity and sustainability goals?
Coca-Cola were in the press out of Atlanta. Coca-Cola, we looked at spend across about 100 of their countries, and they were in the press for wanting to spend a considerable amount of money with minority groups, women-led businesses, veteran-led businesses, a whole suite of minority groups. So we did a lot of work with them analysing their spend across various countries and across these different groups, and would report to them regularly on their percentage of spend with these against their overall spend, and again look proactively at which categories these groups were in and how they could increase that spend, because they were out there in the press with some pretty big targets. So that's a typical one. Certainly in Australia there's a lot of legislation around things like spending with indigenous groups, particularly the government have some pretty big targets, so we monitor a lot of government agencies and corporates on their spend with that. There's a lot of legislation around modern slavery in Australia. Again, we monitor groups for that sort of risk. Scope 3 carbon emissions is coming into legislation pretty soon here. Most people have been focusing on Scope 1 and 2, but I think Scope 3 is going to be coming fairly quickly, and that's something we're doing a lot of work on to be ready for that. So this stuff, quite frankly, never ends. Our approach is a very much a data lake approach. Get the corporate spend and suppliers in shape so we understand that end, then pull in whichever data we need to solve the problem. Because the problem the corporate's got is you can go out there and buy any data feeds you want from an EcoVadis or a Dow Jones, but how do you match it to your internal spend? The other thing we do is we give them one solution across all of these risks. If you're not careful, you end up as a corporate with a point solution for carbon, for diversity, for etc. But in many ways you want to see a suite of risks or a suite of opportunities across the same suppliers.
So earlier, and when you were a minute or two ago, Julian, when you were talking about some of the customers, you mentioned governments in Australia. Are you saying that rather than being the regulator in every case, they are wanting to look at their own practices, their own procurement to make sure? Is that who they are as a customer, or are they more like monitoring others?
No. They, as customers, the government, the federal government in Australia has a certain number of percentage points of their spend they need to spend with indigenous providers themselves. So they have their own targets, and then that trickles down to corporates as well.
I see. So looming behind everything we've been talking about and often driving the effort is the global ESG movement. How do you think it's going? And maybe you have a different view in Australia compared to what we've seen in the US, where there's been a bit of a backlash, political, I hate to say.
Yeah, I'm not going to go there.
Yeah, whatever the reason, it's a big ongoing effort. And so how do you think it's going in terms of companies actually living up to their ESG goals and actually doing what they say?
I'm a little bit of a cynic in this space. I think a lot of big corporates talk up their ESG goals. I'd say, anecdotally for us, a lot more people use us for financial reasons than the whole ESG piece. So I would like to see more uptake. But then I see things like, in the UK, I don't know if you read, but a couple of weeks ago, they finally got off coal power. So in the UK now there's no more coal power, and they're going to be off gas, which I think is about 20% of their power now by 2030. So at government levels, people are doing it. I think they will drag the corporates along. But I agree with you. I see a lot of greenwashing where I see in the press these corporates saying it's all about ESG. But when we offer them some of the functions that we do have, they're more interested in the functions that just save them money, shall we say.
Yeah. We've definitely seen greenwashing. The other thing that political pushback that I mentioned. I guess it's like they say, it's like the third rail, the subway third rail. You could get electrocuted if you talk about it too much. But um, you know, what we've seen here too in the last year, I would say, is people just pushing back on the whole idea of it, and whether that's even the responsibility of a company, especially, well, any for-profit company, and especially a publicly traded company, that they maybe are mixing up their goals there at the expense of profitability. So I think that that's been driving it, a lot of the pushback. That's been the reasoning, and I don't know if you've seen that yourself among your customers or in some of the governments or even Australia where you're located.
Less so in Australia. I've not seen that backlash. I've seen and heard of it a little bit in the US. I mean, personally, I think that companies should act responsibly. I think it's a bit of a cop-out just to say we're here just to make our shareholders money. I do understand, though, that, I mean, what I notice in Australia is the legislation is becoming bigger and bigger all the time. There's like constant pressure on the banks and the corporates to comply with legislation. At the same time, the government says, the big win for us is productivity. Our country is going to be a lot better if we improve productivity. And it's hard to improve productivity if you keep throwing more and more legislation onto your corporates. So it is a difficult balance for sure. Mm-hmm. I understand why the CEOs of the large corporates are complaining, because it's hard now just to get on with your business at a corporate. There is so much legislation around this stuff.
Do you think there's anything that the industry groups and the standards bodies could be doing better as regards ESG?
Industry bodies just, I guess, make legislation sort of clear. I mean, I think more the governments, to me, they need to make sure that all the legislation has teeth. We see a lot of legislation coming out in Australia, whether it's paying small companies on time or whether it's modern slavery, where it comes out as legislation, but there's no real teeth. There's no real fines, or it's almost like a nice to have, so corporates do have the option to ignore them. I think if governments are seriously, they need to impose serious financial penalties.
So how do you think technology, including Robobys, can help with the bigger ESG effort? What more needs to happen, and how important is the technology and all that?
Well, I think technology, I'm obviously biased, but technology, whether it's ours or someone else, is absolutely crucial, because if you have got goals, whether it's for reducing, let's say, Scope 3 carbon emissions, you have to measure it. You can't take it on trust. You can't just say to a corporate, okay, report every year and tell us what your Scope 3 carbon emissions are. We can tell you carbon emissions, to the nearest gram effectively, if we've got access to your spend and your supply base. So we need technology to monitor things, and we need technology to report on things and see where people are against the targets. And all those corporate targets need to roll up to the government targets, because, as you know, the governments have actually all set pretty strong targets. A cynic would say they've set really strong targets for a long time out when they won't be in power, but they've still set very strong targets.
They are, and they are enforced in many cases. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Julian, this has been really interesting to learn about Roboby and to hear your thoughts on all these efforts. Thanks for your time today.
It's been great. Thank you, David, for your time.